Now I have the task of introducing Professor Utsa Patnaik, who is going to deliver the 10th anniversary lecture. Sincerely, I don't know how to introduce Professor Utsa Patnaik in a few words. Personally, I met Professor Patnaik on about 10 years ago, but I feel as if I have known her for ages. So formidable has been her presence in the academia and in the activist world of the Global South. Professor Patnaik is Professor Emerita of Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is one of the foremost political economists in the Agrarian South, and I would say even in the world. And one of the qualities of Professor Patnaik that I would really like to underscore for the not only young generation, but even some of us of the old generation, is her extremely meticulous research and data analysis. She is not the kind of person who simply indulges in generalizations. When she talks about something, she has researched it well and produces both empirical as well as qualitative argument to support it. I first came across Professor Patnaik's name in the early 1970s when she was one of the major contributors to the debate on the mode of production in the agrarian sector of India. That debate was carried out in the pages of the Economic and Political Weekly, and we, the young left faculty and students at the University of Dar es Salaam, used to follow the debate closely. EPW itself, the journal, was a very impressive journal. I believe it is still going on, but I do not know whether it has managed to bypass corporatization. In the early 80s, I had an opportunity to visit their offices in, I think, in Mumbai, and I was amazed that EPW was coming out of a room from the backyard of a building. It was a cooperative of the journalists, a very impressive initiative in which this debate was carried out. Since then, I've had several opportunities to meet Utsa on various occasions and also hear her magnificent lectures, which are always mesmerized me. In 2010, I believe, if I recall the year correctly, I invited Professor Patnaik to deliver a special lecture at the Julius Nyerere Intellectual Festival in Dar es Salaam when I was the holder of the Mwalimu Nyerere Chair in Pan-African Studies. She gave a fabulous lecture which many of us still remember. Later, we published her lecture together with a comment by our brother and comrade Sam Moyo in a small book called The Agrarian Question in the Neoliberal Era, Primitive Accumulation and the Peasantry. I know somehow Amazon Books got hold of it and they're selling it unbeknown to us. But the book, I'm glad to say, is available in a PDF version online, and it's available free. Knowledge is part of the commons, and one should not have to pay for the commons. It's only under capitalist system that even knowledge is privatized and people assert intellectual property over it. So I would urge you very strongly to download that book and read it. I think it remains an important document on the issues that we are discussing in the summer school. And I would like Walter Chambatian Freedom to try and make that book available to every participant of the summer school, both participants in this summer school as well as those who attended the previous summer school. I do not wish to steal Utsa's time because I know we are earnestly waiting for a lecture. I'm told that after her lecture, Professor Patnaik will not be able to stay with us because she has some other matters to attend to. But all the same, if you have time, I guess we can have discussion among ourselves who are left to attend the school. With those few words, a great pleasure to invite you to give your lecture. Thank you very much. Professor Patnaik? Yes, welcome.
Thank you, Isa, for a very generous introduction. It is difficult to realize that 10 years have passed since the Journal of the Agrarian South was launched, and it has been a great pleasure for me to have had some association with the journal. Intellectual gap in agrarian studies relating to the global South, and to a very large extent, the journal has served to fill that gap. Now, getting on to the subject of my lecture today, which is quite broad, when we study world history and political economy, we see that the conceptual apparatus we use and the interpretations that we bring to bear on facts are both overwhelmingly dominated by the European intellectual tradition, and in particular by the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which has been generalized to North America, where the Europeans settled in large numbers. This intellectual tradition developed during the period of the rise of capitalism in Europe, and as we know, the capitalist system then spread and got diffused to the recent areas of white settlement. This process of the rise and diffusion of capitalism was accompanied from its very beginning, from its very inception, by long distance trade and the armed expansion outside their own borders of a handful of maritime European countries. First Spain and Portugal, then France, England, and Netherlands, while the latecomers to external expansion were Belgium, Italy, and Germany. After a gap of 1,000 years, the Europeans revived the institution of systematically enslaving other human beings by kidnapping West Africans from their free communities and transporting them across the Atlantic to work on plantations. The freedom of labor from serfdom in Europe had as its counterpart the imposition of unfreedom on non-Europeans, and we are living to this day with this ugly legacy of slavery in the Americas. The Europeans fought each other bitterly to gain control over trade routes to lands of the global South, and they fought each other and local rulers to obtain direct political control over these populous southern regions in Asia and over the less populous regions in Africa and Latin America. These were the colonies of conquest in tropical regions, as distinct from the colonies of white settlement in the temperate regions of the world. Since political economy and the interpretation of history developed in the global north, simultaneously with the violent rise and growth of capitalism, it is to be expected that these conceptual and theoretical structures would largely reflect the worldview and material interests of the colonizing imperialist Europeans and their extension, the imperialist North Americans. When I was asked to speak on the challenge to knowledge production in the global South, it struck me forcibly that the challenge has really been to knowledge production in the global North, because there has been the intellectual dominance of fallacious theories and highly biased accounts of the history of capitalism. And these have underpinned policymaking in the North, both in the past and to the present day. And it is these fallacious theories and biased conceptual baggage that we in the global South have uncritically imported into our own teaching and into our university courses. So, I would like to take up a few of these incorrect ideas, both of classical political economy and of modern theories here. But in fact, there are so many fallacies that only a few can be mentioned in the short time that I have. First, let us take up Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand, in quotes, that allegedly guides capitalist production. The invisible hand was a non-existent ghost in the machinery of capitalism invented by the author. It was, in fact, the very visible hand of military and naval power of the proto-capitalist state that fueled first the rise of capitalism in England and other countries, and the maturity of the capitalist system was based on state power that promoted later imperialist expansion. The exercise of this very visible hand of naval and military power exercised by the state took place through at least three routes. First, the infamous slave trade, which I mentioned briefly already. Second, discrimination against the manufacturers of other regions of the world. And third, state-sponsored conquest of populations of other countries. The external sources of primitive accumulation, as distinct from the internal source of enclosure and displacement of the peasantry that Marx talks about. The external source of primitive accumulation included converting by force hitherto free labor in tribal and peasant communities into bonded and enslaved labor. Labor recruited by force from outside Europe was thought of, even by the most progressive Europeans, as being from, in quotes, uncivilized regions of the world. And such enslaved labor was barely regarded as human. So the slave trade aroused no moral repugnance in the metropolis as long as it was considered necessary for metropolitan advancement. In fact, in the words of Adam Smith, the trade in slaves and goods with the Americas and the trade in goods with the East Indies, I quote, raised the mercantile system to a degree of splendor and glory which it could never otherwise have attained to. So the slave trade, along with trade in goods, is something which, according to Smith, resulted in splendor and glory. The creation of a free, in quotes, labor force in the European core countries of capitalist industrialization was thus predicated on the imposition of bondage and slavery on the hitherto free labor of many non-European societies. First through chattel slavery, and later in the 19th century through indentured labor systems. This interaction between increasingly free labor in the capitalist core and the new unfreedom imposed by force upon free communities in tropical regions as the dual results of the rise of capitalism. And I would stress again and again that the freedom of labor under capitalism has to be seen in conjunction with the imposition of slavery on non-metropolitan populations, on some non-metropolitan populations. So this interaction between the two has not aroused the kind of theoretical interest that it deserved in the literature. It has simply been taken for granted, well, slavery happened and that's it. If Western Africa had been termed, and I quote from Marx, into a warrant for the commercial hunting of blackskins. This is marked in volume 1 of Capital, page 703, close quote. The question that should have been addressed at the same time is why this was at all necessary for the rise of capitalist production in Europe, when no parallel external expansion or the hunting of whiteskins had been necessary for the spread of the Chinese state or of the Mughal Empire. I will come back to the reasons for this, both external expansion as well as imposition of slavery and political subjugation a little later. Let me take up the second route through which the visible hand of the state operated, that is trade discrimination. And this started long before formal colonization, ever since the Europeans started trading with the global South. And this started from the late 16th century with the setting up of the monopoly trading companies in the first industrial nation in England, which was given by parliamentary charter a monopoly of trade with different areas of the world, the Africa Company, the Eastland Company, and so on. The Levant Company and the East India Company was formed in 1600. These were all monopoly companies set up through charter by British Parliament. Now, the trade discrimination, which was part of mercantilism, but it continues into the era of so-called free trade that Adam Smith as well as Ricardo advocated, consisted in systematically preventing the import of manufactured goods from colonies and from the colonies both in North America. Though of course, the North American colonies soon acquired independence in the lifetime of Adam Smith himself. But it continued for, its inception in the case of India, for example, was from 1700, and it continued for 150 long years. But this kind of policy was also carried out vis-a-vis Ireland. It was carried out vis-a-vis all the other colonies of conquest, colonies of later conquest. The conquest in India, of course, started some 65 years after the inception of trade discrimination. So what was this trade discrimination about? Firstly, there was a law passed by Parliament on the insistence of the English woolen industry that there should be an absolute ban on the consumption of pure cotton goods. Now, pure cotton goods could not be made in England at that time. The pure cotton goods were imported from India by the East India Company and also from Persia. So there was a blanket ban on the consumption of pure cotton goods. And this ban was strengthened this was in 1700, as early as that. It was strengthened in 1721 by amendments to the Act, which imposed very heavy fines on any individuals found to be wearing imported pure cotton goods, and also on the traders who were caught trading in these goods. And it was a very effective ban. The East India Company was permitted to import cotton textiles from India, which was the home of cotton, as Marx had put it, but it could not sell it within England. It could only warehouse it and then re-export it to other countries. It re-exported these textiles mainly to continental Europe and to the Caribbean. On continental Europe, there was a very heavy demand for manufactured textiles. Similar mercantilist discrimination was practiced against Ireland. Ireland's woolen industry was completely killed. It was only allowed to manufacture linen. And its flourishing woolen industry was destroyed. Now, this discrimination in the form of a ban ended in 1784, when after, 1774, when after 3/4 of a century, finally, pure cotton goods could be produced in England. But in its place, that is, the ban on consumption of these of pure cotton goods ended, but there were very heavy tariffs, which were then put on the import of Indian textiles. And these tariffs only went finally in 1846. So 1700 to 1846, you have 150 years of discrimination, of trade discrimination. You look at the Cambridge Economic History of India. The main contributors, by the way, to the Cambridge Economic History of India, the early one, the 1984 one, I've not yet looked at the new one, but I would be surprised if the position there is any different from that taken in the earlier one. Most of the contributors are from India in the Cambridge Economic History, but there is not a single mention, not even in the article on foreign trade and the balance of payments by Professor K.N. Chaudhary, not even on the article specifically on Indian industry and the textile industry by David Morris, there is not a single mention of the discrimination against Indian cotton textiles. Incredible. You have to actually, read the German writer Friedrich List. We have to read Paul Mantoux, a French historian of the Industrial Revolution. Later on, Paul Baran, who wrote about the discrimination. And of course, Ramesh Chandra Dutt in India, who wrote about it. But neither the Cambridge Economic History of India, nor the only volume of the new Cambridge history that I've read by Professor Tomlinson mentioned this. Marxist economists, economic historians like Eric Hobsbawm in Industry and Empire have no mention at all about this mercantilist discrimination. So you see, this is one example of the extremely widespread nature of the bias that informs the writing of history, of economic history in the metropolitan countries themselves. And this has been generalized to intellectuals in our own countries, because we remain intellectually colonized. We take the lead about what to write and not to write from what has appeared in the journals and in the books which come out from the northern universities. But most of the economic history which is written there is actually in the nature of a fairy tale. I'm using this strong term because it departs in so many respects from factual accuracy, and it is also underpinned by theories which have material and logical fallacies, and therefore which are wrong. I'll take up some of the factual inaccuracies in a moment. Now, once they were colonized, the colonies of conquest in the global south, the products that they could produce, a very large range of products, of course, could not be produced in cold temperate countries at all. This included all the tropical crops. And in the early years, it also included manufactured goods like textiles, cotton textiles, jute textiles, etc., because the raw material could not be produced in the metropolitan countries. It was their industry was based entirely on imports. So these tropical goods had, in effect, zero supply from domestic sources at any price for European countries and North American countries. They simply could not produce them. And these tropical goods, therefore, represented, in a sense, goods in international demand. They represented international purchasing power. And that is why we find that when Britain imported goods from India, or the Netherlands imported goods from Java, they imported a much larger volume of goods than they required for their own countries. And they kept a part of the goods for their own use, but the balance they then re-exported to other countries. Because in effect, these tropical goods were equivalent to gold and silver. They represented international purchasing power because there was an enormous demand for these goods, both on the European continent. Not all continental countries, of course, had colonies. Only the maritime ones had acquired colonies, as I mentioned. And later on, this demand was also there in North America. So the interesting thing, again, you find about the problem of knowledge production in the global north, which we import into the global south, is that the trade estimates that are made by the historians of Britain of their own trade are actually factually incorrect and are conceptually incorrect. I'm talking about economic history, not present-day trade estimates, which have to conform to a standard pattern. But right up to the end of the 19th century, beginning from the early 17th century, the data that you get in the writing of the economic historians of England, giving their trade, are all wrong. Why? Because they exclude the re-exports. Now, the reason, the correct definition of the trade of a country is total exports plus total imports. Now, not all countries had re-exports, but all the major colonizing powers, a major part of their imports consisted of goods that they then re-exported, as I've just mentioned. They did not retain all the goods within their country. But they measure trade by taking only those goods that they retained within their own country, only those imports they retained, and only those exports which were manufactured or made or procured from within their own countries. So they exclude the re-exports, both from the import side and from the export side. Now, this is not a correct definition of trade. It is not a definition you will find in any macroeconomics textbook. It is not a definition, well, the macroeconomics textbooks don't give you a definition, but they give you examples of trade, which make it clear that re-exports are included. For example, the trade of Hong Kong or of Singapore exceeds their GDP. And this was because, there were such enormous, there were ports really, Hong Kong and Singapore were really very important entrepôt centers through which commodities passed. So it is very clear. And if you look at the United Nations publications, if you look at the World Bank trade data, all of them give the correct definition of trade, which is total exports inclusive of re-exports, total imports inclusive of re-exports. But the British economic historians give you wrong estimates of their own trade. And I have discussed this in a paper of mine. For example, by the 3 years centered on 1801, the widely quoted book by Dean and Cole, British Economic Growth, Trends and Structure, gives you trade worth 52 million pounds for Britain. The annual average is 52 million pounds. The actual trade was, in fact, 82 million pounds. And the trade to GDP ratio that comes out from their data is 36% trade to GDP. But the actual percentage of trade to GDP, using the correct definition, is 58%. So the gap is enormous. It's not just a small mistake. And the amazing thing is that I find that even 40 years after the publication of Dean and Cole, every author who has given trade data has given you wrong figures, including the authors from American universities who have studied industrialization in Europe. For example, D.N. McCloskey estimates in a widely read paper. There again, it is very clear that the re-exports are being excluded without any explanation why they're being excluded. So when I said that there is a problem of knowledge production in the global north, the reason I'm giving you these figures and the reason I'm actually mentioning names, which actually academics from the global south are very reluctant to do. They don't want to get into a kind of spat with anybody else, particularly people from northern universities. But the reason I'm forced to mention this is that we have to shed this idea that every publication, every bit of figures that you get, which are printed from the University of Cambridge or the University of Harvard Press or whatever, Princeton University Press, that is to be taken as something which is necessarily correct. Not at all. Not at all. Of course, I must add here that the later writers on trade who wrote, let us say, 40 years after Dean and Cole did, but who continue to present wrong trade figures, they're simply following what their peers and their superiors, the people they consider to be their academic, as it were, mentors, have already done. And this is something we in the global south also do. Most of us simply do not stop to think, why are we using this particular concept? What does it mean? What is the meaning of the figures we are producing? Are they conceptually correct? We simply don't bother to think. We simply think that if somebody who is widely recognized to be an authority in a northern university, or if somebody who has got a Nobel Prize in economics or in history, there is no Nobel Prize in history, but anyway, Nobel Prize in economics, has used this method or has presented this figure, it must necessarily be correct. Not at all. You can have very brilliant people in the global north who make mistakes. And the people who follow them continue to follow in their footsteps and continue to reproduce those mistakes. So that is why it is extremely important for us to have a critical attitude and to always look at concepts and figures with a fresh eye and ask questions. Never stop asking questions, because if we do not do so, then we shall never arrive at anything approaching even a correct approximation to what actually happened in history. Now, the third point that I had mentioned, that the state-sponsored conquest of populations of other countries, I do not wish to belabor, because this is obvious to all of you, except to say that an area in which very little work has been done is in the global south itself. There's been no work done on it in the global north at all, is in what way did the process of conquest change the mode of exploitation, or did it involve a new kind of exploitation which is in addition to and not identical with the exploitation of labor under capital? I find that there's a very widely prevalent view that capital in the global north exploited colonies in the global south by extracting super profits from underpaid labor. Now, that of course is true. Wherever the colonizers set up manufacturing enterprises or set up plantations, they did extract very high levels of profit because the wages they paid were so low, and because there was no unionization of labor, the rate of exploitation was very high and so on. But if we limited ourselves to that, we would capture only about 1% of the actual exploitation. Because the labor force in India, for example, that was employed in the factory sector and in plantations combined, even as late as the Second War, was not more than about 1 million persons out of a total labor force of perhaps more than 200 million people. So it was very small. But colonial exploitation involved a completely different method, to which, in a time series sense, no estimates have been made until quite recently. Of course, in a qualitative sense, we have had discussion on the drain of wealth for a very long time in India. That literature is now more than a century old. But you do not actually have a time series estimation of the quantitative measure of the drain before the publication of Professor Amir Bakhchi's book. As far as I'm aware, that's the first time series that is there of the drain of wealth. What is the title of the book? It's escaping me right now, but it'll come back to me in a moment. And I have also attempted a time series estimation of the drain of wealth. And this really consisted in using the taxation and other revenues collected from the colonized population. A very large fraction of those revenues were used in a very novel manner by the colonizing power, and that is to purchase goods for export. Now, in no sovereign country in the world is any part of the budgetary revenues used for purchasing goods which are then taken away to another country. So this basically meant that the importing country, which was Netherlands in the case of Java, which was Britain in the case of India, because the Netherlands used the same method, I have no doubt about it, though I have not seen any estimates. It basically meant the colonizing country did not have to pay for these goods. The peasants and artisans whose goods they purchased out of the budgetary revenues were the same people who contributed the taxes in the first place. So basically, the peasants and artisans were being paid, in quotes, for their own goods out of their own taxes, or that portion of the goods, of their goods that was exported, was being paid for out of their own tax contribution. And only the form of their tax contribution was changing from cash to kind, to export goods. So this is what underlay the drain of wealth, that is a huge flow of commodities, which did not create any payment liability at all for the colonizing power. And as I've already mentioned, they imported these free goods, which they did not have to pay for because they were tax financed, in huge volumes, not only for their own use, but also because they represented international purchasing power for re-export to other countries in order to purchase temperate land goods for them. Now, I don't want to go into the figures. They are available in they're available both in an article which I have written, which was published about 3 years ago. And those estimates are also there in our forthcoming volume, which I have co-edited with my spouse, Prabhat Patnaik, which is coming out from Monthly Review, hopefully by March, called Capital and Imperialism. So, I don't want to get into figures there, but the figures are really of the drain are really absolutely enormous. And I think that one of the important tasks that economic historians have in the global south now is to go into the quantitative data wherever these data are available. And certainly they would be available for Java. They would be available for some of the countries that the British colonized in Africa. They would be available for France vis-a-vis the countries they colonized in Southeast Asia. The trade data would be available, the revenue data would be available, and to make an estimate of the real extent of colonial exploitation, because so far we have not had any estimates apart from very recent ones, which I've just mentioned, even though the discussion has been there for something like 100 years. Now, let me discuss a few more problems with knowledge production in the global north. One is this whole idea that there was an agricultural revolution in England. Now, Isa Shivji just mentioned the book in which he also wrote, and Sam Moyo had written, which is available online. And a major part of what I wrote in that book, in that ebook, was to point out that Britain actually did not have an agricultural revolution in the sense of rise in productivity. It certainly had an agricultural revolution in the social sense that is discussed at great length by the social historians of Britain, like the Hammonds and by Trevelyan and by Tawney, and of course, above all, by Karl Marx, when he discusses the primitive accumulation of capital. That is the throwing out, the eviction of small farmers from the land, consolidation of land holdings into larger units, the conversion of petty producers into a class of propertyless persons, which was a necessary condition for the creation of a proletariat and so on. Those social changes undoubtedly took place. But the other part of the idea of agricultural revolution is that there was a huge increase in productivity, that British agriculture was able to feed its population. If you go on to read the entry on agricultural revolution in Encyclopedia Britannica, or if you go on to Wikipedia, online, you will find that there is everybody is talking about how productivity rose. Now, that is factually untrue, because there has been a debate. In fact, I wrote an article on this some time ago, which was not published. In fact, I wrote this paper something like 30 years ago, but I wanted to do more work, and I did not publish it then, pointing out that the per capita availability of the basic food staple, which was grain in Britain, actually declined between 1700 and 1850, basing myself on the work of Chambers and Mingay and some other people who had written by the 1960s on British agriculture. Subsequently, in the 1990s and the first 5 years of the present century, there's been an extensive debate involving at least 5 or 6 scholars who have gone into detail. They're not interested in talking about agriculture, interested in the analytical question. This is really an empirical investigation into what actually happened. And their research confirms that per capita availability of food actually declined precisely during the period of the so-called agricultural revolution, which is supposed to have raised productivity. In fact, yields rose by a very meager percentage, yield did rise, but to a very small extent. Cultivated area did rise, but again, there were limits to expansion because Britain is a small country and it could not keep pace with population growth. So the per capita production actually declined. It was only imports and increasing demand, increasing dependence on imports, and primarily imports from the colonized South, primarily from the colonies in the global South, that permitted the food supply to continue uninterrupted. And even when food imports were from the European continent or from North America, a large part of the payment by Britain for these imports came from the free goods that they obtained by way of transfers or drain from colonized countries, of which the largest and most important at that time, of course, was India. So without reliance on colonialism, actually the Industrial Revolution would have been impossible. Even so, even with imports, we find that there was such a problem of food availability that the condition of the poor reached starvation levels, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. And the demand for free imports became the major political economy issue in Britain for something like 50 years, from the late 1780s right up to the 1830s. So, if you read the economic history of Britain, which is written by their own economic historians, then you will find that they are very sanguine. They say, no, Britain had no problem. It could meet its own food requirements. So here again, factually completely untrue. And in both cases, both in the case of not taking re-exports into account and giving wrong trade estimates, and talking about agricultural revolution succeeding when it did not succeed, there is a bias which is introduced by the desire to say that the dynamic for industrial revolution came from internal factors. There is a bias which is introduced by a complete ignoring of colonial transfers and of the necessity of colonial exploitation for the very rise of capitalism at its very inception. That is, in the first industrial nation itself. And of course, if you investigate the situation in France and in Netherlands, you would find exactly the same. As a matter of fact, Netherlands was even more dependent on imports than Britain was, because it has even poorer resources, domestic resources. And all through the 18th century, re-exports of tropical goods from Java and so on was more than Netherlands' exports of its own domestically produced goods. So coming back again to the whole question of knowledge production, I think it's time that people in the global South started a correct analysis of what actually happened in history, including in the global North itself, because their historians and their economists have proved themselves to be unequal to the task. To this day, Ricardos' theory of comparative advantage is taught not only in northern universities, but it is taught in every Indian university, in every university in the global South. And it is taught uncritically. But it's a wrong theory. Why is it a wrong theory? And here I have to say very quickly that there are, if there is a fallacy in a theory, then the theory itself is incorrect. And there can be many different kinds of fallacies. Logicians classify fallacies into three main types. Material fallacies, which arise from an incorrect statement of fact. Verbal fallacies, which arise from incorrect use of terms. And formal fallacies, which arise from an incorrect process of inference. Now, what has happened, particularly in the discipline of economics, is that you have had a phenomenal development of the formal side of economics, whose essence, of course, is mathematics. And that side has developed hugely. But ever since philosophy was no longer taught and no longer learned by economists, and by the way, there was no independent discipline of economics at the time that Adam Smith wrote. There was what they call moral philosophy. And anybody who wrote on economics would be a person who would be fairly well read, as Adam Smith himself was, on history as well as philosophy. And as part of philosophy, they would have studied logic. I don't know at what point it became the case that students of political economy no longer studied philosophy. I think even up to Keynes's time, this was not the case. Keynes himself studied philosophy, had no formal training in economics, actually. But somewhere there was this divergence where students of economics stopped studying either history or philosophy, and therefore they stopped studying logic. And therefore, logical mistakes in argument, which are not formal in nature, but which arise from incorrect statement of fact or incorrect use of terms, became very common. And Ricardo is a very, very ideal example of that. And Ricardo, as you know, is practically a god in the pantheon of economic pioneers. I mean, when I started criticizing Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, some of my own students were absolutely scandalized. And they made it clear that they were scandalized. But you see, Ricardo's theory contains a very simple fallacy, because what does his theory say? His theory says that, taking a two-country, two-good model, that if both countries, if you calculate the relative cost of production of goods, and what is a relative cost of production? Supposing you take Britain and Zimbabwe, and you take the two goods as raw cotton and cotton cloth, okay? So the relative cost is, if you take Zimbabwe, if you reduce the output of raw cotton by 1 unit, the labor that is released and goes into cloth production, cotton cloth, manufactured cloth production, how much will the output in that rise? And similarly, you do that calculation for Britain. So that is relative cost. So if you find that, by reducing the output of raw cotton by 1 unit and transferring the labor to the other activity, you get a higher output there in Zimbabwe than in Britain of cotton cloth, then Zimbabwe should specialize in cotton cloth production. And Britain should specialize in raw cotton production. The only problem is you cannot define the cost of raw cotton production in Britain, because Britain cannot produce raw cotton. The climate forbids it, just as it cannot produce coffee or tea or cane sugar or dozens of other commodities, which are both foodstuffs and raw materials, just as whole of Northern Europe, the whole of North America simply cannot produce these goods. So the cost of production is not definable, and therefore relative cost is not definable. Now, the conclusion that Ricardo reached, that both countries will benefit from specialization and trade according to their comparative cost advantage, has then been generalized and applied to situations, to tropical countries as well. When I went to a conference in 2005 in Berlin, in Germany, which was on food security and free trade, all the speakers are saying, as Ricardo has demonstrated, if the developing countries open up to free trade, they will benefit. Not only the developed, but the developing countries will also benefit from free trade. No, because this idea of benefiting from free trade was being generalized to a situation where Ricardo's assumption did not hold, where the cost of production was not definable at all for a range of commodities that developing countries produce. This cost was not definable for the advanced capitalist countries at all. This is a material fallacy. That is, the fallacy lies in the assumption both countries can produce both goods, which is not true of primary goods at all. It is true of manufactured goods. But primary goods production is constrained by climate. So this assumption does not hold for primary commodities. I remember Joan Robinson writing quite correctly that Ricardo's theory rules out trade between the two sectors that the kind of trade Adam Smith considered most important. That is the exchange between agriculture and manufacturing. But then, which was quite right, but then she should have generalized it to say that Ricardo's theory actually rules out trade between the industrial north and the global south, trade in primary commodities, trade which involves any primary commodity, but she did not do so. She says Ricardo's theory has nothing to do with the problems that the global south faces. So one part of her statement was right, but the other part I think was completely wrong. So this makes Ricardo's theory wrong, and it makes for a situation where, to this day, the advanced industrial countries have demand the products of the agriculture of the global south that they simply cannot produce at all. To this day, we are in a situation where the advanced industrial countries have enormous surplus produce as far as grain is concerned, as far as dairy products are concerned, but their populations are not interested simply in consuming grain and dairy products. They want to consume coffee and tea and cane sugar, and nowadays they want to consume in the middle of winter fresh produce from the global south, which can be air freighted in a matter of, maybe 4 hours to London and Paris from Africa. It can be air freighted from India in a matter of 8 hours to London and Paris, in a matter of 15 to 16 hours to New York, Boston, Chicago, and even San Francisco and Los Angeles. And what is 15 hours? You can air freight fresh produce. So we have new demands on tropical lands, which is recreating the typical structural features of colonialism. Incessant demands by the global industrial north on access to our land. But the whole problem with that is, as I've written at great length, and I'll be winding up my talk very soon now, because I think I've already taken at least about 50 minutes, perhaps, 45 minutes at least. I'll be winding up in the next 5 minutes or so. Many people are very, very puzzled. What's wrong with that? If we can produce commodities that the global north cannot, and they demand those commodities, and they want to sell their food grains to us, that's a good thing. That kind of specialization is good. No, because the global north is not really, the industrial countries are not really interested in the situation of food security for poor populations in the global south. They are interested in markets for their surplus products. Canada has to export half of its entire wheat output because that's all it can produce, and its own domestic population consumes only half of its output. So 50% of its output has to find global markets. The United States has to export a quarter to 1/3 of its entire output. The European Union is in a similar situation. All they want is to dump their products, which they cannot sell domestically, on our markets. And therefore, the situation is exactly the same today as was described by Cecil Rhodes. I'll give you a quote from Cecil Rhodes. Very often, it pays to look at what imperialists, die-hard imperialists are saying, because they're far more honest sometimes than the liberals are. He says, this is a quote from Cecil Rhodes, "We must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies." Of course, people wouldn't say slave labor anymore, but the rest of the sentiment remains, because they want special economic zones where they can come in and take advantage of very low wages in developing countries. That bit was not Cecil Rhodes, that was me. Continuing with the quotation, "The colonies would also provide a dumping ground for the surplus goods produced in our factories," and here I would add the surplus goods produced in our fields. So that is what we are seeing today. At the moment, right now, there have been thousands of farmers who have been protesting for 8 weeks now on the borders of Delhi. They are not being allowed to come into the capital, national capital regions, against 3 laws which have been passed by the government. Similar laws had been passed, or similar policies had been implemented in dozens of developing countries already. Misguided measures undertaken by their governments who do not understand the danger to our food security. That even though our lands are far more productive, we produce 2 to 3 crops a year compared to only 1 crop in the global north, we cannot possibly meet the demands for filling supermarket shelves in the global market all through winter and summer, and at the same time maintain the availability of basic staple grains and other commodities which our own populations need. The moment we privilege external trade in primary products, which is what the advanced countries want us to do, the moment we privilege filling up supermarket shelves there over the food security of our own population, then the availability of basic staples for our own population goes down, and that is precisely what has been happening in the period of neoliberal opening up to free trade, which started very early in African countries from the 1980s, and I have documented the very sharp fall in domestic grain and plantain availability that Africa had, sub-Saharan Africa had, during the 1980s and 90s. And that is precisely what happened in India from the mid-1990s, when we opened ourselves up to this kind of specialization. To the point that now we have one of the lowest per capita food grain availability in the world. It is lower than the average for Africa. It is lower than the average for the least developed countries. And our farmers know the danger now, that the laws which want to introduce contract farming in India, and which effectively, by deregulating the markets where commodities are bought at regulated prices, that is being deregulated under these laws. That is going to allow the minimum support price that they get from the government to be thoroughly undermined. So they have been protesting against these laws, and they have got it right. Our intellectuals have not got it right. They are still giving us the jargon they have learned from the World Bank and from northern universities about efficiency, about how opening up to global trade will improve conditions for our farmers, etc. Not at all. Our farmers are planning to hold a historic parade, and it is expected that 200,000 tractors will take part in this parade tomorrow, that is Republic Day. So let us see how their protest plan pans out. But this is one, as it were, bright spot for us in an otherwise rather gloomy scenario. So there are many, many other fallacies which characterize knowledge production in the global north, which we have uncritically imported into our own thinking. But I don't think I have the time to go into those fallacies now. One very important one, which I have not had time to talk about, is this whole scandal of the poverty line, where again, a fallacious method is used where you define the poverty line in one way, linking it to a nutrition norm. But then for the last 40 years, every country which is estimating poverty has departed from that definition. They have delinked it from any kind of nutrition norm, with the result that their poverty lines now are a joke. The poverty line is such, including in countries in Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Tanzania, and so on. It will only buy about less than 2 liters of bottled water. And the poverty line is supposed to cover everything, not only your food cost, your daily cost of utilities, your daily cost of whatever you buy of manufactured goods in a month divided by 30 to give the daily cost, your daily costs of transport, of medical care, everything. And the actual amount is something which will buy hardly 1 to 2 liters of bottled water. That is all. And yet, every government in developing countries in the world is carrying out these false poverty estimates and grossly underestimating the actual level of poverty, which is very high and which has been increasing and not declining during the period of implementation of neoliberal policies. But how exactly the correct poverty line is to be measured, and we can do it on the basis of the data we have in India, certainly. And what the gap between the correct poverty line and the official one is something I do not have time to go into today. But I have been writing about it at great length, and I hope to be able to publish a book on it by this time next year, hopefully earlier. So thank you once again for your patience in listening to me, and best wishes, more strength to your elbow, all those who are bringing out the Journal of Agrarian South. A very good work which needs to be continued, and we all support you wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. Thank you very much for a magnificent lecture. And no doubt we will publish the lecture in Agrarian South so that you can have access to the written part of the lecture, because I think it contains enormous amount of material, and particularly knowledge production, which still haunts us, because it is in knowledge production you reproduce the division of labor. That is to say, we produce data and they produce theory. They are the ones who theorize. They are the ones who produce knowledge. We produce raw material in the form of data. So I think this point that is made by Utsa is extremely important. And as I said, the lecture will be available in written form very soon. As I said when we began, Professor Patnaik unfortunately has to leave. I'm wondering whether you would have time to take at least 1 or 2 questions, or shall we excuse you?
I can take a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, professors agreed to take a couple of questions. May I have your questions? So if you want to ask orally, then just raise your hand, please.
Isa, I think it would be best if you collected the questions and gave them to me. I mean, read them out to you, to me.
Okay. Can you please put your questions in the chat box? I don't see any so far. Well, does it mean that you are still digesting what has been
That's
said?
okay with me. If anybody has digested and then has a question, then they're welcome to mail me the question.
Oh, someone says a very big meal.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
sorry to
think
have given you such indigestible material.
no, it's very digestible, but it takes time to digest, because
Mm.
you are undoing what has been done over last centuries, in terms of knowledge. So it takes time. It's
Yeah.
very digestible. I think it's very clear, and I really hope that that our people will pay close attention. I see compliments here. Great lecture from Professor Utsa. Thank you very much. And if there are no questions or comments, then I think we should allow Professor Patnaik to leave us. And if anything develops in the course of discussion, the last half an hour that is left, we will forward them to you. Utsa.
Yes, please.
Once
I'd be
again,
happy
thank you very much.
to take
Thank you very
something.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
This is the lecture, I think, Paris, we should really produce in our Agrarian South Journal as soon as we can.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.